This is the Improve Your Chess video series for ICC and WCO members. In this video, we are going to take up the subject of rook against connected passed pawns. The first couple examples we're going to give, I'm not going to actually show real positions where there's kings on the board. I want to show what the rook can do against the connected passed pawns if none of the other pieces are involved. So we're going to assume there are kings on the board, but let's assume they're sufficiently far away that they can't affect the play of the rook versus the two pawns, but we will assume they can move. In this position, the rook is on a rank that's higher than the connected passed pawns, and I've purposely chosen to put the passed pawns on the 5th and 6th rank. So the question is, if the kings are sufficiently far away, what should white play here to best try to stop the pawns? You might, in each of these, you might want to take a minute, stop the video, and see what you can find. The answer is that the best move here is rook to e6. Rook to e6 freezes both pawns. If black now pushes the pawn to e2, white can capture rook takes e2. If black now plays d3, white can play rook takes e3, and on d2, white can play rook to d3, winning the pawn as well. Now, suppose after rook to e6, black makes a move, and I'll edit the board so it's now white's move. Then what would white do next while the kings are still far away? The answer is white can make progress by playing rook to e4. And now with the king sufficiently far away, he still has the pawns frozen. But now, again, assuming black makes another move somewhere, white can now play rook takes d4, and if black tries to make a run with it with e2, he can play rook to e4, and he gets the pawns. That means that if we go back to our original position with the rook behind the pawns, that white can make progress and win the game by putting his rook behind the more advanced pawn and then attacking the rear pawn and winning the pawns. Now, of course, if the kings are much closer or there's other pieces involved, it gets a lot more complicated. But it's good to know that if the rook's fighting against the two connected passed pawns and they've only reached the 5th and 6th rank like this and no further, that if the rook's behind the pawns, it can not only stop them, but it can win them. Suppose the rook is in front of the passed pawns. What would you do now? Well, the answer is you follow the same principle, which is put your rook on the same file with the more advanced pawn. If you put your rook on the other file, let's say you played rook to d1, then black can play e2. And now if white attacks the pawn, black's going to push the other pawn, white would bring his king closer, and then black would push the pawn to d2, and black would win, so that would be losing. So white instead has to put his rook in front of the more advanced pawn, and now again both pawns are frozen. If e2, of course, rook takes e2. If d3, rook takes e3, d2, rook d3, and white wins. So after rook e1, the pawns are frozen. Black has nothing better than to bring his king closer. Now, unlike the other position where the rook was behind the pawns, white can't make any progress with the rook, and the only thing that white could do is bring his king closer also. And if white's king is just as close as black's king, then white will be able to neutralize the pawns, eventually win them, and be able to mate with a king and a rook against a king. If black's king is much closer than white's king, of course, black might have excellent drawing or even possibly winning chances in these kind of positions. All right, finally, what are we going to do if the rook can't get in front of that pawn or behind it, the e-pawn? Suppose the rook starts exactly on the same rank as the more advanced pawn. What can white do here? Well, the answer is he can just bring his king closer and hope that his king's close enough. If he tries to play rook to d3, black simply plays e2, and white has no way to guard the e1 square. Rook e3 and rook d1 are guarded. On the other hand, if white does nothing and just lets black make a move, black's going to play e2, white would play rook a1, black will play d3, and eventually black's going to play d2 and get a queen. So actually this position is losing, which leads us to a very, very common and important principle, which is rooks will lose to connected passed pawns in the 6th rank. So if we make this white's move, and white plays here, black can not only win with e2, but he can win with d3. and even if white goes back and skewers the pawns, one of them's going to queen. So the principle to remember is a rook against two connected passed pawns that have reached the 6th rank, in this case the 3rd rank for black, the pawns will beat the rook. Now we need some practical problems to show how this can be helpful in games. Alright, this position is white to play. We're in a race between the white queenside pawns and the black kingside pawns. And again, take a minute and ask yourself the question, what would you do here for white? All right, based on our previous example, the right answer is to get your pawns going as fast as possible. It really doesn't matter which pawn you push, but I like to push the pawns that have the rook behind it first. So you'd play something like b6. If black then gets a queen, white captures, black captures, and now we have those two connected passed pawns in the 6th rank again. And black can't stop them. If he puts the rook behind one of them, you push the other pawn. Rook takes, white goes up and gets a queen. And now black's going to try to hold on for dear life, trying to guard some of his pawns and try to get a draw, but obviously white's the one playing for the win here. So in this position, you want to get the pawns rolling as fast as you possibly can. Now suppose you don't know that, and your clock's running and you think, oh my, let me make a move so I can figure this out. I'll make an innocuous check, and that'll give me more time to think. So the question now becomes, suppose white plays rook to b2 check. Is that move helpful? Is it harmful? Or is it neutral? Think about that for a second and come back to the video. If white plays rook to b2 check, black will get out of the check, and now black's threatening to get a queen. So whether white plays rook to b1 or rook takes h2, we'll end up with roughly the same tempos. And now after rook takes h2, b6, we use our rule that the rook belongs behind the more advanced pawn. And now black has frozen your pawns, and that'll give him time to get his own pawns start rolling while white tries to run up with his king. And of course, this isn't nearly as good as the previous position. Black should win this position. So it turns out this innocuous looking check loses a very vital tempo. So whenever you're in positions like this and you think, well, I'll just give him a check and gain some time on the clock and figure out what I want to do, that's not always the right idea. Here, it's much, much better to push a pawn with b6. White will be an entire tempo ahead compared to playing rook to b2 check. And again, white's goal is to get those connected passed pawns in the 6th rank as fast as he possibly can. All right, in this position, black has the connected passed pawns, and white is the one about to get a queen. This is white to play. What would you do? Well, the obvious first move is to win the rook for the pawn, go up, get a queen. Black will take, white will take, and now black needs to get his king up as fast as possible to try to help the pawns. The pawns can't go up by themselves against the rook, so something like king f5, king b7, king f4, king c6. Notice white's bringing his king back as fast as possible. There's no way the rook could possibly fight against the king and the connected passed pawns by himself. If you try to just do it with the rook, black would win rather easily. All right, white plays here, black plays here, and now the best thing for black to do is try to head for a draw. And black will get his draw here, rook here, king here, and white can't make any progress. So if we go back to the original position, if you get the queen, the rook can fight against the connected passed pawns, but it needs the king's help to try to draw. All right, but in positions like this, things are very often a lot more difficult than they seem. The right first move for white is to play rook to h6 check. Why, we'll see in a second. Now, most players who see rook h6 check and are playing this out for the first time immediately say, well, I need to get my king up to help the passed pawns anyway, so they play king to f5. And now the whole idea is, rather than winning a rook for the pawn, it's much, much, much better to get an entire queen for nothing. So you play rook to a6. Now if black trades rooks, rook takes, king takes, let's say king g4, a8 queen, king b3. There's several ways white can do this. He could put his queen in the corner for now and then start bringing his king up. If black tries to play something like king to f2, then queen checks is going to win. For instance, black would play here, white would just keep coming closer, and now black doesn't have any way to make progress. If he plays g3, queen takes h3 will win rather easily. On the other hand, if black tries to play this way, white would continue to bring his king closer, black would play here. Now here's a good maneuver to know. White would play check. Black would play here, let's say. And now white would simply play queen to f3. If g2, queen to g3 check. And we have what I call a go-to-sleep position because black can't make any progress. White can just bring his king closer and win all the pawns easily. Or, of course, if h2, then queen takes g3 check will win the h-pawn. And finally, if king to h4, then queen f4 check, king h5, queen takes g3, wins the h-pawn as well. All right, so after rook h6 check, king f5, rook a6, trading rooks for black is hopeless. So black's going to try to get his rook on the 8th rank. And what he wants to do is check white's king. And now if black puts the rook in the way, white puts the rook in the way, black can just play rook to a1 again. And unless white wants to go into one of those rook against two connected pass pawn endgames that we already looked at, white would have to play here. So the right move when black plays rook b1 check is to play king to c7. And now again, black has nothing better than to check rook c1 check. White plays king to d7. Black plays rook d1 check. White plays king e7. Black plays rook e1 check. And now, thanks to this rook, thanks to the king on f5, white can play king f7. And the king shields the other king from checks on the f-file. And now black has no way to get his rook down to the first rank. And white's going to get an entire queen. And with a queen and a rook against a rook and two pawns, white will win quite easily. So what we see is after rook check, king f5, this will allow white a path to run safely across and shield his king after rook a6, and white's winning. Now after I show my student a position like that, they decide, well, maybe they should move their king down where there's no shield. So they try something like king f7. And now rook a6. And now rook to b1 check. Now there's no place for white's king to run to shield himself. So eventually white's going to have to come up and let the rook get to the 8th rank. And he may as well do it right away. He'll play here. Now black cannot go to the 8th rank here because the pawn guards b8. So he's going to have to check again. And now the white king goes to d5. And now finally rook to c8, a8 queen, rook takes a8, rook takes a8. But now we have a completely different position than we had before. Before, the black king was up on f4, f5, and the white king was all the way back on a8 when white had queened the pawn and he had to take it back in the corner. But now white has actually gained about 5 tempos over that position. And those 5 tempos mean it's going to be an easy win. As we've seen before, if black just tries to push the pawns, then what we learned at the start of the video was white can go behind the advanced pawn when it hits the 6th rank, and he's winning. For instance, if king to g7, then rook to h4 will win. And if king to g6, then king to f4 will win. If instead black tries to bring up his king, white will just get his king in front of the pawns. And even though it's a little bit tricky here, for instance, here white can block off the king, but black can try to do nothing here. The problem is he doesn't have a lot of good nothing moves. If he plays g3, king h3 wins. If he plays h3, king g3 wins. If he plays king to h5, then rook checks drives him away from the pawns. Then eventually white can try to come up and hit these pawns, and they're not going anywhere since the king is cut off from the 5th rank. That's not all the lines, and this may not be the best way for white to play it. But in any case, with care, white should be able to win this endgame rather easily. So as it turns out, this is actually a white to play and win problem. Rook to h6 check, and black can pick his poison. He can allow the shield for the king by moving his king up, or he can lose a few tempos by going in the wrong direction and letting white play here. The moral of the story is, when you have a position like this for white, when you see a good move like a8 queen winning a pawn for a rook, look for a better one. See if you can block off the piece that's attacking the pawn and get an entire queen, and not just win the pawn for a rook by getting a queen right away. I see this mistake quite a bit with weaker players. They're so excited about promoting a pawn and getting a queen and winning the rook that they forget that they could do a lot better if they could get an entire queen. Here's a made-up position. When you have the rook fighting against the connected pass pawns, and you're going to have to give up the rook for the pawns anyway, you want to wait till the last possible moment to do that. Now, as we saw in the previous example, if black had a piece that he could put on f6 here, like let's say he had a rook on h3 or a bishop on a5, well, bishop on a5 would take the rook, but let's say a bishop on b4 to go to c3, then white would need to play rook takes c2 right away. And if he does that in positions like this and reaches a position here, then if we count the tempos, this is going to be a draw. King takes h7, b4, king to g7, always trying to be careful not to go on a diagonal where it's checked. Here it's not a problem. b3, h7, b2, h8, queen, a1, queen with an easy draw. So we can see that if for any reason white has to play rook takes c2, it's an easy draw for black, and that's why I picked this position. However, in this particular position, there's no reason for white to hurry. If black pushes the b pawn, he's going to have to do that anyway after the rook takes the pawn, so that doesn't help black. And if white plays king takes h7, which is a much, much better move, and now black queens, there's a whole difference, which is black had to spend an extra tempo pushing that pawn before white got it. And now when white plays rook takes c1, king takes c1, again, we want to be careful not to move our king on this diagonal. So the best thing to do is play king g7, pawn up, pawn up, pawn up, queen, b2. And now we can go back to another video that I did for the ICC earlier, which is queen versus pawn on the 7th rank. And one of the things we learned in that video was that queens can beat pawns on the 7th rank if they're knight pawns or center pawns, even if the king is well placed. Here, the game would go something like queen c8, check, king d2. We're going to zigzag our queen up, queen d7, queen c6, queen d5, queen c4, check. And now the key move, queen to b3, king to c1, queen to c3, check, forcing the king in front of the pawn, which is the last thing black wants to do, because whenever he goes in front of the pawn, white can go up with his king and get closer. King to a2, pin the pawn. Now if black comes up, white will just play queen to b1 and go to sleep. So king to a1, queen checks, forces the king in front of the pawn. King here. King c1, queen c4 check, king d2, queen b3, the key move. King c1, queen b3 check, king here, king closer, and so on, and white would win. So in this position, if white gets hasty and says, well, I have to take off the pawn anyway, I may as well do it now, which is actually what happened in the game that spurred this idea, then white is drawing. But if white is smart and waits till black gets a queen, which you should almost always do unless he can block the file, then king takes h7, c1 queen, rook takes c1, king takes, and white has that extra tempo, and that extra tempo is enough to win. All right, I hope you enjoyed today's video, which was rook against two connected pass pawns. Next time you get into a position where a rook is going to be chasing those two pawns, hopefully the ideas that you learned in today's video will help you. For ICC and Chess FM, this is Dan Heisman, and we'll see you next video.